Okay, so I think numbers are still creeping up a little bit, but holding a bit more steady. So we might make a start now, and colleagues can join us. We've got a bit of an introduction, so colleagues can join when they're ready. Could you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. Just on to the next one would be great. Thank you. So welcome to everyone joining this webinar on the new condition on harassment and sexual misconduct. I'm Susie Allenson, the Safeguarding and Welfare Manager, and I'm really pleased to be chairing today's webinar. As you can see, there's lots of people here with us today, which is brilliant, including staff from providers, charities and other organisations and bodies. We understand you'll be familiar with how the condition's framed. Today is really an opportunity to discuss the condition in more detail, focusing on our requirements and how these will operate in practice. So as a result, we've assumed some prior knowledge, so we can spend as much time as possible answering your questions. As there are so many of us, please keep your microphones muted throughout. We are going to record this event, but just the presentation section. We're not recording the Q&A, so we'll switch off recording for that. And that's really to help everyone feel more open to participating. For the Q&A, we won't be asking you to raise your hands. We're asking you to submit your questions through the Q&A box, and you can do that throughout the presentation. And we will try and answer as many as possible in the time that we have. Given how many attendees we do have, we won't be able to get through every question, as I'm sure you can understand, but we will do our best to group questions together to get through as many as possible. And we'll also be trying to get through as many of the pre-submitted questions as we are able to. We'll be focusing on questions to help you understand the requirements and how you might work towards compliance, rather than questions about how we arrived at these requirements, unless we have time to do so. Our outcomes report that we published in July explains the rationale for the decisions we made, so I'd really encourage you to read that thoroughly if you haven't been able to already. Since we'll be grouping questions together, please don't worry if we don't get to your question right away, and please do ask questions as they occur to you throughout the presentation, but some of the content might be covered in the presentation. So that you're aware, when you ask your question, your name will be visible next to it to all the other participants. But as I said previously, that won't be recorded, and I won't read your name out loud when I pose it to the panel. We're asking participants not to disclose any personally identifiable information during the session, including not referring to any individual students or staff by name or in any other way that might allow them to be identified if discussing potentially sensitive issues particularly, and any personally identifiable information that we do capture will be fully anonymised after the meeting. And then just to mention, we are of course discussing sensitive topics today, and we recognise that some of the definitions and the language we'll be referring to might cause distress. So we're asking you to please bear this in mind for your own attendance. Next slide, please. So due to time constraints, we won't be able to cover every element of the condition, but we'll be focusing on key areas and topics where we've received a high number of pre-submitted questions and where we know that there is particular interest on these areas. So our focus today will be on implementation and our expectations rather than broader policy questions. We really want to help you prepare to do this work. So in terms of how the agenda is going to run, we've got about 90 minutes. So after this introduction, I'll briefly talk about the timeline and consultation responses. And then David Smye, our Deputy Director for Regulation, will be talking about the condition requirements. And we've got about 20 minutes or so there. And then Rob Denny, the Student Services Manager, the Student Surveys Manager, will be discussing the pilot prevalence survey on sexual misconduct. And after that, we've tried to allow about 40 minutes for Q&A, so plenty of time to get through as many questions as we're able. Next slide, please. So introducing the team, as I said, we've got David Smythe, myself, and Rob Denny who'll be presenting. We're also joined by Arif Ahmed, Director for Freedom of Speech and Academic Freedom, who will be joining us just for the Q&A to answer any questions that relate to the relationship between the new condition and existing freedom of speech requirements. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background. This is an area that the OFS has been involved in for a number of years, and through Catalyst funding, HEFCE and the OFS have provided 4.7 million to 119 projects to tackle sexual misconduct, online harassment and hate crime. In April 2021, following consultation, we published a statement of expectations, and this gave a set of recommendations to support providers to develop and implement effective systems, policies and processes to prevent and respond to incidents of harassment and sexual misconduct. In October 2022, our Chief Executive, Susan Lapworth, spoke to the House of Commons Women and Equalities Committee and confirmed the OFS intention to consult on a new condition of registration on harassment and sexual misconduct and to develop a pilot prevalence survey on sexual misconduct. And this really had come through in the independent evaluation we had commissioned on the initial impact of the Statement of Expectations, which was published in November 2022. One of the recommendations was that we consider making prevention and response a mandatory duty and part of our regulatory framework. So last year, we consulted on introducing a condition of registration on harassment and sexual misconduct. And as you know, we published the outcomes of our consultation at the end of July and announced new condition E6. Requirements related to non-disclosure agreements came into force on the 1st of September this year, so are already in force. The rest of the requirements of the condition will come into force on the 1st of August 2025. In the meantime, the sector will be preparing for the condition coming fully into force, and we are engaging with you during this period to support the preparation. And we will share more information about our upcoming student webinar at the end of today's session. For those interested, please do share that with your students. Throughout this academic year, during the time before the rest of the condition fully comes into force, we're expecting providers to develop robust policies and processes. We really expect you to use this time to engage with your students while you're developing this work, to understand what your students want and need, and ensure that your approach will work for them. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the consultation response. Thank you to all who responded to the consultation. I'm sure many of you attending today had input into responses. We received 261 responses to the consultation, and a particularly high number of responses compared to other consultations from students and student representative bodies, which was 17% of the total. Most responses were received through an online survey, but we also ran 3 roundtables with students to really facilitate them to be involved. And we held webinars for students and providers and spoke at sector events to help understanding in what we were asking for feedback on. Next slide, please. So I'm now going to hand over to David to talk through some specifics of the condition requirements. All information is available on our website, and the condition text and regulatory guidance is the definitive source for providers for compliance. David's going to go through a few select aspects of the condition requirements based on questions people have asked in advance of today and that we've received in our conversations with the sector. Over to you, David.
Thanks a lot, Susie. Am I visible now? I think so. Yes, good. Nice to see everyone, or I can't see you, but I'm glad to see you all in the chat. Your names coming up. You'll all have reviewed the condition obviously before today, but we did think it would be useful to give a brief overview of the requirements before getting into Q&A. I should say that I am sort of summarising here. So as Susie was saying, please do kind of refer to the condition as kind of the source for the precise wording, formulation, and all the sort of detail, rather than my precise words, which may trip over themselves slightly more than the word on the page. Having said that, can we go to the next slide, please? So in terms of summarising what the condition contains, it starts by looking at the scope of condition, which includes what the subject matter is. So what is harassment and sexual misconduct? What is covered by the condition, and what students and what situations are the responsibility of providers. And we'll have the slide after next, and the one after that will look at those questions specifically. Then it sets out the requirements relating to policies and procedures. So that includes the requirement to maintain and comply with a single comprehensive source of information. It includes the minimum content requirements and the content principles and provenance principles associated with that single comprehensive source of information. So a lot of the condition focuses around that single comprehensive source, and we're going to speak more about that in a moment as well. There are then requirements relating to intimate personal relationships between staff and students, which we'll talk about on the next slide. There are requirements relating to capacity and resources, so that the requirement to have the capacity and resource to comply with this condition in particular. And there are requirements relating to freedom of speech. So there are freedom of speech principles that we've set out because of concern that we want to make sure that essentially that in seeking to comply with this condition, providers don't accidentally not meet their freedom of speech requirements or more widely not uphold free speech. And we want to kind of help clarify that for providers in thinking about their particular policies and their particular response. There are specific requirements about the restricting the disclosure of information. So that's about NDAs is the usual way to frame that, although it's wider. And as we've said, the requirement against NDAs came into force at the start of this month, so ahead of everything else. And then there's a definitions sort of element of the condition, which includes some quite substantive elements of the condition that are captured in the definitions that they're not a secondary element by any means, because they make sense of a lot of the rest of it. So they include definitions of things like harassment, sexual misconduct, abuse of power, and other kind of important concepts. Can I have the next slide, please? So we wanted to highlight some aspects of the condition, particularly where they've changed in response to consultation feedback, because I know a lot of you would have been engaging really closely with this as part of the consultation process as well. And so the consultation version of this might still be in some people's minds. So the first thing is the single comprehensive source of information. So in the version that we consulted on, we talked about having a single document that captured the required information. We wanted it, the idea there being that people knew where to look. It was sort of guaranteed it was all one place. It wasn't spread across lots of different areas where students could be confused about what was present or find it difficult to find what policies were. We did get a lot of consultation responses on that about concerns about the sort of practicality of having things in a single document. So we broadened it out in terms of a source of information, which means it could be a single document, it could be a single web page, but it could also be sort of a starting point document or web page that summarizes required information that links to the more detailed policies on individual matters. So it doesn't all have to be sort of contained on one file, but again, the underlying driving principle that students need to know where to look and what they'll find is incredibly important. The information that we specify in the condition that must be contained here includes information on prevention, information on reporting systems, investigation processes, support for students, and training for staff and students, as well as covering what the provider is doing to protect students from abuse of power in intimate personal relationships with staff. So it remains the kind of the hub of the condition, but it's defined slightly more flexibly for kind of practical purposes than the original version was in the condition. On staff-student relationships, the requirement here is framed around having to have policies that would protect students from abuse of power and address sort of abuse of power and conflict of interest. I saw a comment, one of the early questions, saying that the condition states that if a provider doesn't ban relationships, then it doesn't meet the condition, and that's not quite right. What we've said is that if it does prohibit relationships between students and relevant staff, as we've defined it, that is a way that meets the requirement. So if you do that, you know that you've met the requirement. But we do leave it open that providers may find a different way to meet the requirement in their particular context and given their particular student needs and setup. What we have said, though, is that does need to be a kind of, an effective measure. It's not just sort of do something, it has to be something that's effective. And we've said specifically that simply kind of stating that the provider is opposed to or discourages relationships wouldn't be enough on its own to meet the requirements around staff-student relationships. We although that might be part of a package of measures alongside more kind of substantive things. So we need the condition requires kind of real action on this. We're clear that a prohibition is a way to achieve that, but we're open to other ways and individual providers. Freedom of speech principles. This is really important, that providers have to comply with the condition in a way which is consistent with the freedom of speech principles that we've set out in the condition. That's concerned with the importance of freedom of speech and making sure that it's a fundamental condition when providers are producing policies and processes to tackle harassment and sexual misconduct, and then when it takes action under those policies. So when providers are thinking about harassment and sexual misconduct, for that to be done in a way which is joined up with how they're thinking about their very important requirements that sit on them around freedom of speech as well. And the freedom of speech principles include a rebuttable presumption to assume that exposing students to course materials, to sort of statements made, views expressed as part of teaching and research and discussions about subject matter of a higher education course are unlikely to constitute harassment. So it's a rebuttable presumption. It's not saying that that's a kind of an absolute law, that harassment cannot exist in those contexts, but the starting point should be that things may come up in course materials, in class discussions, which are shocking, that are kind of difficult for people, but that those should not be they should be assumed not to be harassment unless it can be sort of demonstrated that they are in practice. And then lastly, non-disclosure agreements and other restrictions of disclosure information. As I said, this has already come into effect. And it means that providers mustn't prevent or restrict students from disclosing information about an allegation of harassment or sexual misconduct. And we think that's really important that NDAs can prevent students from speaking about their experience. They can protect the reputation of perpetrators and of providers at the cost of allowing inappropriate behaviour to continue and making it harder to deal with the underlying problems. Could I get the next slide, please? So I told you I'd return to scope. So we have had some questions on the scope of the condition. I think it's really important to clarify up front before we get into more detailed questions. So the condition E6, new condition, applies to both harassment and sexual misconduct. While there are some specific elements relevant to one or another, one or other of those two, the condition fundamentally is about both, and most of the structure of the condition is about both. And I know that some of the report and some of the response has kind of focused on either one or the other. But structurally, the requirements around the single source of information, to have information on support for students, investigation processes, training, etc., apply to both harassment and sexual misconduct. And the condition covers all incidents that fall under our definitions of harassment or our definition of sexual misconduct, which I'm covering on the next slide. So that includes both harassment on the basis of protected characteristics under the Equality Act and harassment as defined by the Protection from Harassment Act. Some of you have also asked about how the condition applies in relationship, whether a partnership arrangements between different providers or where students are studying abroad. And so we've provided on the slide here E6.1b, which makes it clear that essentially it's broad, and we talk about this in paragraph 2 of the guidance as well. So it covers any higher education course provided by or on behalf of a provider. So that could mean providers registered with you, providers, students registered with you. It could include students that you teach but aren't registered with you, or who are studying for an award by you. And that includes UK-based and non-UK-based students. So it's broad, and that could mean in practice that more than one registered provider has to be thinking about how it makes sure that students it has a responsibility for are protected under this condition. And that's kind of similar to how our regulation works in other areas around sort of quality and so on. Can I have the next slide, please? So you'll probably recognise the definition of harassment on this slide. We've made clear, so it's an important point here about the definition of harassment is we've made clear that the condition does cover the conduct of students towards other students, so including sort of Equality Act type harassment, students to other students. Importantly, we do make clear, and this is paragraph 10 of the guidance, that this doesn't affect a provider's obligation under the Equality Act. So we're using the wording of Section 26 of the Equality Act in terms of what we're saying harassment is, in terms of defining it and having clarity about what that means. But what we're not doing is sort of seeking to extend the Equality Act itself. And I think that's important because the Equality Act itself doesn't give rise to legal obligations for a higher education provider to address conduct by a student that amounts to harassment. So it's a different picture here. We're saying that this is a useful term for us, a useful way for us to understand harassment for regulatory purposes, but it's not extending the legal requirement beyond what it is. And we're clear, as we say in it's quoted here, guidance paragraph 58, that providers aren't required to do things that interfere with lawful speech in order to meet the requirements of this condition. So putting these things together, one of the things we're trying to do in this condition is to create obligations for higher education providers to do things that deal with harassment that go further than simply complying with the existing law. But we only want them to do that where that doesn't involve doing things that might have the object or the effect of restricting freedom of speech within the law or restricting academic freedom. And so providers will have to think really carefully about their freedom of speech obligations and have particular regard to those obligations, place significant weight on those obligations when they're creating policies and procedures that are designed to tackle harassment. On the other hand, it's really important that freedom of speech obligations shouldn't become a sort of barrier to creating policies or applying policies to tackle harassment, unless there actually is a risk that could have the object or effect of restricting free speech. So it is something where providers will have to think really carefully. It's not a kind of as long as I'm trying to stop harassment, I can sort of not worry about the freedom of speech obligations. They are really important and need to be really properly thought about. On the other hand, that shouldn't lead to sort of not doing things that would be perfectly possible to do without interfering with freedom of speech. That providers will need to find a way to kind of walk that line in an appropriate way. Can I have the next slide, please? So sexual misconduct, so the second big definition of the condition. So you'll also recognise this. It's very similar to what we consulted on, that there is a shift, which is in response to some of the feedback we got during consultation. We've removed the references to the Sexual Offences Act from the list of those bullet points of what's covered. So the previous version still listed sexual harassment, sexual assault, and rape, but it said as defined in. We now simply use the terms as they're kind of generally understood. We think that is sort of remains kind of clear for providers and students and addresses some of the concerns that we had in the consultation. We've made clear sort of in the consultation and in the response, this isn't an exhaustive list, so it includes but not limited to. So the key of this definition really is the any unwanted or attempted unwanted conduct of a sexual nature. So we include the examples partially to make really clear that the most serious forms of sexual misconduct are covered. So that this isn't a you have to tackle sexual misconduct unless it gets to the level of being a kind of criminal offence, which kind of goes elsewhere. It's that you have to to tackle the kind of the wide range of sexual misconduct, and we quote some of the guidance there to make that clear. And then next slide, please. The final thing I wanted to touch on, I think we've had quite a lot, because we've had, I think, quite a lot of questions on this one, is around student training. So again, this is framed as includes but not limited to. So providers may identify that they need to do kind of additional things to ensure students' understanding. But the two parts that we specify are one, that all students need training to make sure they understand providers, policies and procedures as set out in that single comprehensive source of information. So that loops back round to that single comprehensive source of information again. And secondly, that at induction, new students need training to understand what behaviour might constitute harassment or sexual misconduct. And that we've had questions about what we mean by mandatory training. So I should say that the sort of bullets that we've set out here, this is a requirement. So the requirement to have appropriately informed to ensure understanding applies to students as a whole. So these are mandatory requirements, that mandatory training. We've put something in the condition guidance at paragraph 27 to address some questions around how that might work in practice. So that clarifies that we expect the training delivered to students to be mandatory for them to take part in, but that we do recognise there might be sort of individual circumstances where a student might find it very challenging to engage with such training, for instance, where they previously experienced harassment or sexual misconduct. And the guidance clarifies we expect providers to use their judgment on this in a sort of similar way, that obviously you will need to be thinking about those sorts of exceptional circumstances in other contexts. So it's not it's mandatory, but we recognise that there may be exceptional circumstances, and we recognise that providers will want to think kind of carefully about how to do that in practice. I should also say that we've said in the guidance that we'd expect providers to support students to participate. So I think if we found that a provider said, a large proportion of our students feel that they can't engage with our training because they find that the way that it's done would be too sort of traumatic given their past experiences, I think we would want to be asking, well, what are you doing to make students feel more able to participate in it? How are you, taking steps to make sure that they can take part, rather than simply saying, oh, lots of students aren't taking part. So there should be a sort of an active attempt to draw people into it. We've also questions about whether this, does this have to be in person? Obviously, some provision is kind of fully online. So we've made clear that our concern is not with online versus in person per se. Students can be trained online, as long as the training is otherwise kind of up to standard. So it's evidence-based, it's credible, and importantly, it allows for sufficient student engagement. So online training is fine, but an online training which is kind of low quality, kind of click through a few slides which say, this is what HM is, and that's it at the end, and there's no opportunity for discussion or kind of clarification, is sort of unlikely to meet the requirement. We've also questions about bystander training and whether that's a requirement of the condition. So bystander training is listed in the guidance, paragraph 26 of the guidance. Sorry, you'll hear me refer a lot to paragraphs of the guidance. It is really useful. As an example of how providers may demonstrate they've complied with the requirements. So it's a thing that can be done to meet the requirement, but it's not, the requirement doesn't require bystander training sort of by name, and as such it is a way that you could meet the requirements of the training. It was something that was identified, I think, as part of the independent evaluation of our statement of expectations, that the bystander training was identified as an example of really excellent practice in the sector. So we would encourage people to look at it, but it's not required. And the last thing on student training, and before I pass over to a colleague, is I think there's been some questions here and elsewhere about, do we need to submit lots of information to you about how we're training the students and how many students we've trained and who's doing it and all those sorts of things. And the general point here in other elements of the condition is that we're sort of monitoring this in the way that we normally do. We're not expecting to ask people to send us lots of information about this or other elements of the condition. So there should be lots of sort of form filling for us. On the other hand, in general terms, this and indeed any other requirements that we have, we expect as part of kind of governance and compliance that providers keep kind of appropriate records of their decisions and of what they're doing. So you don't have to tell us lots of stuff up front, but obviously if we came to a provider and said, how many of your students are receiving the training and what are you doing to make sure they are being trained, is the sort of information that we would sort of expect providers to have available if there was a reason that we were wanting to discuss it with you. So having said all that, and I'm sure we'll come back to lots of this in the Q&A, but I will now hand over to Rob, who's going to say a little bit about the pilot prevalence survey that we did.
Thanks, David. Hello, I'm Rob Denny. I'm a student survey manager at the Office of Students. So I was going to give you an overview of our prevalence survey. So our starting place was why undertake a prevalence survey? We started from a position that the current understanding of prevalence of sexual misconduct and HE in England was underdeveloped. We're relying on reported crime data and ONS crime survey of England and Wales, and a range of really helpful but individual level provider surveys. So all of this was helpful for us to understand that perhaps sexual misconduct was widespread, but it wasn't clear on the extent and scale of the issue. It was also a key recommendation from the independent evaluation of our statement of expectations that there should be a national prevalence survey on sexual misconduct. And in doing so, we could create a better understanding of the rates, context and incidents and areas of underreporting. So in 2023, we developed and ran a pilot survey to understand how widespread sexual misconduct was in higher education in England, and to learn more about the context in which those incidents might occur. The survey will also aim to inform the design and approach for any potential future wide-scale prevalence survey. So in terms of our aims, rather than focusing on a single institution or a subgroup of students, the survey sought to include nearly all students studying HE courses at providers. So in that respect, it was the first and largest of its kind, we think, in the UK. So it was really important that we piloted the approach. The questionnaire we used was developed with a group of expert stakeholders. So these were expert academics and practitioners who work in this area. They offered incredibly helpful advice on the design and approach that we could take. Also offered some advice on research ethics to ensure that we were taking steps to minimise harm to participants. The questionnaire drew on international best practice in this area. So there's a survey called the Sexual Experiences Survey, which a lot of international surveys are based on, particularly around sexual misconduct. So that was our starting point. We then looked to develop that questionnaire by testing it with students to ensure that it was suitable for a UK context. So we ran quite an extensive programme of qualitative pre-fieldwork testing with students, where we asked them to go through the questionnaire with some professional interviewers. And in doing so, we looked to ensure comprehension of what we were asking and gauge how students received the questions. And we also wanted to trial some of the contextualizing information that we put around the survey as well. So we wanted to make sure the students really understood what we were asking in the questions, but they were also clear about what they were going to be asked and how and what was coming up next. And in doing so, we aim to explore to what extent and at what level it was possible to obtain data on prevalence of sexual misconduct in HE in England. So our fieldwork ran from September into November 2023. 12 providers agreed to take part, so a really big thank you to those providers who did so. There's quite a lot of effort from the data teams in particular, helping us do some of the administration in the background to this. And we've got a full list of these providers on our website. So it was 12 providers in England. Unfortunately, we couldn't include colleges in our pilot because of differences in the way that the administrative data on students is collected and stored, which meant that it wasn't possible to include them. In terms of the fieldwork itself, students were contacted by a contractor that we appointed to undertake the fieldwork for us. They were contacted initially by email through their institutional email address. And then we contacted them another 2 times through both institutional and personal email addresses. So there wasn't lots of chasing. We thought this was probably appropriate given that this was a pilot and also given the subject matter. It's also worth saying that in each of the survey iterations that from each of the different providers, we offered links to local and national resources throughout the survey, so that if students were affected by any of the things we're asking them about, then they were directed to appropriate resources. We also put appropriate content warnings in place in prominent places throughout the questionnaire and made clear that students could exit any time. One of the things that we found, one of our key findings actually, was that response rates were really quite low, certainly a lot lower than we'd hoped for. So they were around 4%, which gave us a little over 5,000 student responses in total at the end. However, it's not unusual for a survey of this kind to have quite a low response rate. Next slide, please. So I'll just give you some of the key findings from the survey. I'll just say that actually all this information is available on our website. There's a results document together with an evaluation report and a really nice Tableau visualization of the data, which sets out all the aggregated data from the pilot. And it also breaks it all down by demographic characteristics, so you can explore that if you have an interest. The other thing to say about the questionnaire was that we didn't ask students if they had experienced, for example, sexual harassment. Instead, we asked students, we presented them with a list of behaviours, and then we asked if they'd experienced any of those behaviours since being a student, and then again, whether they'd experienced that in the past 12 months. So the idea is that we get a much better measure of instances of sexual harassment, because it might be that someone might not identify having been sexually harassed, but the behaviours they've experienced do constitute sexual harassment. So some of the headline figures are, we found that 30% of our respondents had experienced sexual harassment since becoming a student, and 20% said that this had occurred in the past 12 months. If we looked into this a little bit more, we can see there's greater prevalence for certain groups of students. So female students, 27% of those had experienced sexual harassment in the past 12 months. Those with a disability was 32%. Bisexual students was 37%. Gay lesbian students was 34%. And we also saw that age was important as well, with prevalence being greater for those under 21. That was 31% had experienced sexual harassment in the past 12 months. We also found that perpetrators were most often men, that was 79%. And of those who'd experienced sexual harassment in the past 12 months, just 12% had sought support from their provider. We also asked a series of questions on sexual violence and assaults, including rape. And we adopted a similar kind of behavioural approach to that design as well. So we listed a set of behaviours and asked if people had experienced those. So our headline figures here were 16% had experienced sexual violence or assault since becoming a student. 9% said that had occurred in the past 12 months. And again, the prevalence was greater for some groups over others. So for female students, that was 13% had experienced sexual assaults or violence or rapes in the past 12 months. Respondents with disabilities, that was 18%, and bisexual students, that was 22%, and gay lesbian students, 21%. And again, those under 21 were more likely than those over 21, so that was 16% had experienced that in the past 12 months. Perpetrators were most frequently students from the university, and again, they were most likely to be male, that was 85% male. We also found 1% of students had had an intimate relationship with a member of staff from their university. And they asked a series of questions around support-seeking behaviours. So a couple of statistics here. So around half of students were confident about where to seek support within their university, within their provider, for experiences of harassment or other forms of sexual misconduct. but we do see some differences by sex here. So 34% of female students and 21% of male students were not confident about where to seek support. Okay, so I'm going to hand back to Susie now, who will chair the Q&A.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thanks to all the presenters for that detailed information. Hopefully that was really helpful for lots of attendees. We're now going to stop recording. As I mentioned earlier, we just recorded the presentation part of today's webinar, and the recording of this event up to this point will be published on our website in due course, but not the Q&A portion.